So good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to say that I'm very glad to be here and present in front of you. On the other hand, it's a pity that I had to substitute Khalid. I hope that next year we can meet him and listen to his talk during f-kʒn. I hope he recovers quickly. So today I prepared a topic on hunting beacons. That's the general agenda for today. I divided this presentation into 3 parts. Part 1, more generic on hunting the HTTP beacon. Second part, focusing on HTTPS. But actually, I lied here. It will be a very specific case of a protocol that was invented for the North Korean APT Lazarus, and was actually very interesting protocol for connecting to C2. It's a fake TLS. And part 3, a very quick introduction to do something else, to hunt the C2 servers early, so to detect not the beaconing characteristic, but the C2 servers. So short introduction about myself. For most of my career, I worked as a network defender and as sysadmin also for the Polish Navy, both mostly on the incident response side, but also as a pen tester of different naval systems. Currently working mostly on the threat intel part. So let's begin with the part 1. So beaconing over HTTP. Let's begin with a kind of a definition. What is beaconing? So generally speaking, the beaconing characteristic for the malware is a type of communication where the malware does not keep a one long connection to C2, but instead the malware connects to C2 periodically. And those beaconings can occur regularly at constant intervals, but more frequently they occur at pseudo-random moments of time. You can compare it to the communications from the submarines. Submarines do not keep the constant communications with their headquarters. They surface, they go to the periscope depth only on the specific times just to send and receive the messages. Then when they receive the communication, then go deep into the sea and operate. So it's a kind of a naval comparison. Probably the most popular meme during this edition of f-kʒn. How to detect the beaconing. Can we prepare the signatures, the snort rules, for example, for beaconing? Probably it's very, very hard, almost impossible, because this can be one example of the beaconing. So can we prepare a signature matching for such a communication? When the payload is hidden, it's very often obfuscated, encoded, and additionally encrypted. This is an example from Cobalt Strike, but many other malwares in the world use such similar characteristics. So it's very difficult to prepare one signature to detect that and trigger an alert that it is that kind of communication. We can, for example, alert that it is Cobalt Strike. No, it's it is almost impossible. On the other hand, sometimes your rules, even the simple ones, maybe you wouldn't expect them. Sometimes they trigger if the adversary makes a mistake. This is kind of a mistake when the adversary prepared a little bit wrong profile for his beaconing malware. In this case, there's an alert from Suricata that IDS detected that HTTP response body is not gzipped, but it was declared that the whole body is compressed. This is this kind of mistake. You can see that the content encoding is gzip, but actually the body. So in this case, the ACAR put it in the beacon is not in a real format of the gzip. So let's go to the real detection of the behaviors of the beaconing. These are the examples I prepared for today. So 4 hypotheses, and let's check them if we can try to detect the beaconing characteristics with those 4 hypotheses. So first one is focus on the analysis of the intervals of connections, and the last 3 are more focused on the HTTP headers. that are configured for the beaconing malware. So the data set that I use for this presentation is mainly from the cyber defense exercise. It's from actually the Locked Shields exercise that's carried out by NATO every year. So generally, the pickup from this exercise was processed by Bro IDS. Nowadays, it was renamed to Zeek. And we use the HTTP log from this IDS. What are the alternative data sources? It could be also the flows, if you would like to analyze the intervals of connections, but it can also be the web proxy logs. You can see in the table what kind of information you can get from one line of the HTTP log. So you can see that you can have some information from the HTTP request, but also from the HTTP body. So you've got information from the flow, like source IP, source port. You can have some HTTP requests, like cookie or user agent, but you also have information from the body, like the respond body length, and all those things can be also used to prepare the detections of the beaconing. So let's go to hypothesis 1, how to analyze the connections intervals. This hypothesis is based on the assumption that connection intervals from malware to C2 are distributed around some average value, that they are not pseudo-random. Why do we assume that? Because often the malware in the configuration has such options like sleep or jitter. It's also an example from the Cobalt Strike, but many other malware in the wild also use similar configuration options. So in this configuration, the operator put the malware into sleep for 60 seconds, and they put a kind of a jitter, so the pseudo-random value of 20% just to make it more random, just to make it not connect at constant values, like every 60 seconds, but for example, in the interval between 48 and 72 seconds in this example. How to detect that? So maybe let's go back to school and use some, sorry for that, we have to go back to school and remind ourselves some statistics metrics, but let's try. We would like to generally find this type of characteristics when the connections and the intervals of connections are distributed around some average value, more or less. So what kind of example data do we have here? We have example of the beacon A, which is a Cobalt Strike payload with configuration of 60 seconds and jitter of 20%, and the beacon B of the Cobalt Strike when the operator puts the beacon into sleep mode manually. So as we see in the table, we've got 6 samples of such connections. For the beacon B, the values are more random, and for beacon A, they are more or less distributed around this average value. I put also the other statistics metrics like standard deviation and also the variation coefficient. And this is a very simple math because the coefficient of variation is just the standard deviation divided by the average as the percentage of it. So we can find if the data are diverse in a more or less extent. So in the case of the beacon B, when the operator is manually putting the beacon into sleep mode, we can see that those intervals are very diverse, and for automatically beaconing malware, those values are not that diverse, and the coefficient of variation is quite small. It's even very close to the jitter value. That's the Splunk search. Sorry for that. Maybe it looks quite terrible, but I will focus on some of the details of this search. In this case, we generally try to aggregate the connections by 3 things, like source IP, destination IP, and the user agent. And in the second option, we try to prepare the detection threshold. So in this case, I detected that the coefficient of variation should be less than 100%. I should get at least 10 connections, and the average beacon time should be over 1 second. This query was also inspired, like in this link here, by the Splunk team. In their I recommend you go to their blog because they have very interesting hunting methods using Splunk. In their case, they try to hunt the beaconing over DNS. They use different statistics metrics. They used variation, which is also okay. And excuse me for that. So this is the result of this query. In this case, we detected from this data set, from this cyber defense exercise, one of the C2 servers. We can see that the characteristics, that the average beacon time was 7 seconds and the standard deviation was plus minus 3 seconds. So we can say that it was a very interactive session and the operator had a hands-on keyboard when interacting with this beacon. On the other hand, this kind of method and this attitude can also help us detect maybe a kind of a long-term operation of a beaconing. In this case, we detected another C2 server, but the beacon time, average beacon time is about half an hour, 28 minutes, plus minus 7 minutes. So we can see that it wasn't a very interactive session. Probably it was used for keeping and maintaining the access, maybe kind of backup channel. But this kind of approach for detection can help us also detect such a beaconing with a low frequency of occurrence. So this was the hypothesis 1, which I hope it proved that it is possible, it is doable to detect such beaconing characteristics using these statistics metrics, very simple ones. Let's go to the hypothesis 1. So in this hypothesis, we try to analyze the URI. For example, we assume that adversary is using a backdoor that has several C2 backup domains included. Do we find such malware? Yes, it is. In this example of the Cobalt Strike beacon, there's also such an option to put several domains, C2 domains, into one configuration, into one of the beacons. So there is a possibility that one type of malware is going to connect with the same URI to different host names. This is a kind of a Splunk query to implement this hypothesis. So let's focus on the most important details of this query. We just use the HTTP log from Zeek. So we analyze the request and the response data. We try to exclude several false positives, like favicon, ICO, admin, because those URI can really be on different host names. And we aggregate with the logic of this one is to ask how many different hosts have requested were requested with the same URI. This is the aggregation part. This is the detection part. In this case, I chose the threshold of 3 different hosts. It's because of this data, characteristics of this data set. So we detected 5 unique C2 domains discovered for 2 similar yet different URI requests. And going to the third hypothesis, which is also based on the URI analysis, but focusing on another aspect of the HTTP header, so the referrer. So generally, when the normal user, when the typical behavior of the user which is browsing a web page is when he goes to another URI, then the referrer of the last visited web page changes. Malware usually does not implement such a behavior, so it's a kind of the weakness or the characteristics of the malware, so we can try to use it for detection. If we are countering the referrers on single destination and we try to aggregate it and we put some detection thresholds, we can find such new C2 servers. And in this case, those URIs were related to the first stage malware. For C2, we can see that on one single destination with none or same referrer, we can find various URIs, and this method was also useful for us. So hypothesis 4, we discovered another C2 domain using another approach. So we tried to look for different URIs, but the length is constant. Very often when the malware is trying to put the payload into the URI, the encoded, encrypted payload into the URI, usually the length of the URI is constant. And in this case, we discovered another C2 domain with 3 different URIs with the same length hosted on the same destination IP. And sorry for spoiler, but if you would like to see different types of hypotheses than the Jack Crook mind map, which he prepared some time ago, is a great set of hypotheses. We implemented several of them you could see on the previous slides. We hope that one day Jack is going to come because he was supposed to be on the first f-kʒn. We keep fingers crossed for him. So it's also a very good way to find the inspirations for detecting the beaconing part. So let's go to the part 2 and focus on beaconing over HTTPS. And actually, like I said before, it will be not a generic detection of HTTPS, but just a fake TLS example from the Lazarus APT. So just to understand how does it work, it has worked for several years. I'm aware that it worked until 2018. I don't know if they still use this protocol on 2019. I'm now more focused on different kind of threats. So generally, that's the idea behind the fake TLS. So the handshake for the TLS is fake, and the real communications of this with the C2 server between the backdoor and the server is after the handshake. So the handshake is the funny part when for example, the C2 server just sends back the real and often expired certificate, which is just copied from pages like WeTransfer, Google.com, Dropbox. So they try to make us think that we are connecting to such popular sites. And in most cases, our systems, our network analyzers, they analyze mostly the handshake, so the beginning of the TLS session, and due to the cost of the resources, the analyzers are switched off after the handshake. So they took advantage of this fact, because the real communications is after the handshake. Actually, it's not TLS. The encryption is symmetric. There is a pre-shared key, usually RC4, which was preloaded into the backdoor. C2, of course, know this symmetric key, and this is the real communication. So does it beacon? Yes, this is an example of fake TLS. This is a graph of actually the sizes, the length of the messages, encrypted messages between the backdoor and the C2. And what's interesting about it? First of all, we can see that the maximum message size used for the communication is fixed. It, in this case, is 808 bytes. So it's one possibility to prepare a detection. But another interesting part is that the beginning of the real communication after the handshake has also fixed size messages. So for example, first 5 messages are always of the same length. Is it really hard-coded? Actually, yes. If you look into the code of the backdoor, you can see on this example of the second message that is of the size of 24 bytes, that it's hard-coded into the backdoor's code, that it should have that 24 bytes. What can we do? about this fact, we can prepare a kind of SSL TLS profiling. So we can prepare a kind of TLS profiles to detect those kind of communications. So if we only analyze the sizes of the first 5 messages of encrypted application data which occur after the TLS handshake, it can help us detect the traffic to a known C2 infrastructure that use the fake TLS. So did anybody recognize what can be wrong with those messages, with those sizes? So if we analyze it more, especially the length of the messages, then it turns out that the TLS algorithms for every message, they hash the values. So for example, if we use the MD5 and the length of the MD5 from a message is always 16 bytes, then we can see that it's impossible to have such a connection over TLS where the messages are of such low sizes. So it's impossible that it could be a real TLS communication because the sizes are lower than 16 bytes. For the fake TLS, it's even 8 bytes of the communication, so it must be something different, something that is not a real TLS. So where can we use this knowledge? Where can we hunt fake TLS? One option is to be, of course, we can detect it in our own networks. We can prepare such analysis, such detections. We only need a good, very configurable network analyzer that can analyze the TLS data after the handshake. Not every network analyzer can be reconfigured to analyze the data after the handshake. On the other hand, we can go and be kind of proactive. We can, for example, download the pickups from the services, from the sandbox services like hybrid analysis, and we can try to match our profiles to those pickups. That was one of the options I used to detect unknown infrastructure for Lazarus and trying to check this hypothesis. So this was the part 2, so very specific case of detecting the HTTPS beaconing that was not a real HTTPS. And let's go to part 3. It could be something more offensive, but only a general introduction to the topic. So we can always hunt the C2 servers. So not only the way the malware communicates, but we can also find the C2 servers or the redirectors. Of course, like guys from Outflank showed us today, red teams can also, and the adversaries can monitor themselves. Probably they should monitor, but we can try to hunt them. Now we know that we have to be more stealthy about such proactive activities. So generally, I grew up in 1990s, and there was a general strategy in NBA that the offense starts with defense, and that was also the plan for my presentation, that first of all, I tried to begin with hunting and detecting beaconing on mine playground. But if I feel comfortable about detecting different mechanisms of beaconing, I can try to be more proactive and try to hunt them when they are preparing, so on the maybe weaponization stage, when the malware is being prepared. This is just a quick intro. So for example, if you take the 2 very popular frameworks for the command and control, like Cobalt Strike, which is a commercial product, or PS Empire, you can see, this is a data source from the Mitra attack, that several APT groups use this kind of software. So what can we do about it? For sure, we have to know the defaults of such frameworks. In case of Cobalt Strike, Nothing fancy, but we have to remember that for the Cobalt Strike, the console port, the default port is the 550 over TCP, is the console the operator connects to the team server. Sometimes if they make such a mistake, you could see on the day one that the infrastructure for the adversary could be quite complex. And if it is complex, that the adversary can make a mistake. And for example, sometimes they can make open port for the management. It's not only for Cobalt Strike, but the very custom C2 servers from different APTs are always also have the management port. In the case of Cobalt Strike, there is a kind of a characteristic. There's a default one. For the DNS listener, when there is a DNS request to this DNS listener from Cobalt Strike, then the answer is always like that. Of course, it can be changed in the configuration, but it's the default. Another interesting aspect of the Cobalt Strike is that it's based on the nano HTTP server, which is a Java implementation for HTTPD. And this is a typical message. For example, if you would like to request for any URI, not for the one connected with the malware, we probably will receive by default this kind of response, which is also kind of one of the characteristics of this kind of C2 server. This is something new that was made, not discovered, but made more public lately with the new edition of the Cobalt Strike 3.13, that for many years there was a kind of additional space. I don't know if you were aware of it. There was additional space after the response, after the code. So after the word OK, there was additional space. It was also a signature of the Cobalt Strike, which was based on nano HTTPD server. So going to the conclusion, adversaries, tools, and procedures are often have patterns. So our job as threat analysts is to uncover those human factors, those human traces, and also sometimes adversaries' weaknesses to connect them and understand what are their limitations. And for sure, we should burn the defaults if we are aware that our adversary is using Cobalt Strike, PowerShell Empire, or any other framework or custom tool that we analyzed. We have to use this knowledge to burn it, and for sure we have to burn everything that's connected with open source and commercial C2 servers. What is known, what is default, this should be detected by us and prevented. So thank you for your time.